And so I looked at the Marshall Plan, right? This is America helping 16 countries, including the UK, after World War II. You take that, you convert it to 2015 dollars, and you realize that it's a $130 billion investment. I mean, this was called the most generous gift from one nation to another in the history of humanity. And decades later, Apple is spending double that amount in just a 5-year period in China. And of course, the most controversial thing, or the most interesting thing about that, besides the dollars, is that this is at a time when it's already clear that China is America's greatest adversary.
Today, I'm talking to Patrick McGee, the author of an amazing new book, Apple in China, which tells the story not just of the world's most powerful company, but also reveals its integral role in China's economic rise and dominance. The interconnected nature of the fates of China and Apple tell us so much about the way in which our world and the way in which contemporary markets and power operate. Patrick, pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure.
One of the key insights, and there are so many fascinating things that the book draws out, is that Apple was integral in China's own economic growth, that Apple depended to an extent for its growth initially on outsourcing. That took it to China, and in the end it created an almost sort of Frankenstein's monster economically. Can you tell us just a little bit about what drove Apple to China in the first place and what the consequences have been?
Yes, well, in the 1980s and 90s, we have to remember that China was really a backward place following, several decades of rule by Mao. And they didn't have the skills, they didn't have the jobs, they really did not have a great economy. I mean, when Mao dies, we're talking sub-Saharan Africa levels of economic development in China. So Deng Xiaoping really recognizes this and basically sets out to create places like Shenzhen, right? Basically a fishing village, as it were, that, today is a population of some 17 million people full of skyscrapers, right? But back then, series of fishing villages. And the idea was, let's experiment with capitalism in these confined zones. And specifically, we will draw in foreign direct investment. We will draw in, talent coming from Hong Kong and Japan and Taiwan. And hopefully these countries will teach our own workforces how to build things. And they start with simple things and, apparel and so forth. But the whole hope is that you'll move up the value chain and you'll learn as you go. So there is a sense in which, this was sort of directed at the behest of Beijing's top echelons of leadership. What I don't think they ever anticipated was that a single corporation like Apple would end up being sort of such a perfect conduit for Apple to move up the value chain. And so I really tell this sort of multi-decade story of the moves that China makes in terms of industrial policy, let's say, in terms of the 12-hour working days among hundreds of millions of people who begin to move to all these industrial clusters, and the role that Apple plays. And so you sort of have this perfect marriage of skill, which is what Apple had, because you have to remember, the company was founded by two Steves in a garage in 1976, tinkering, engineering, building things themselves. But they don't have scale, and that's what China has. So it's a marriage of skill and scale.
And of course, we know that Steve Jobs was an iconic figure in Apple's rise, that Johnny Ive, a Brit, was the designer who ensured that Apple had that edge when it came to attracting the consumer's eye. Why was it that Apple necessarily felt that China was the place where they could achieve scale? Why didn't they use the American home market, 300 million people, and some skilled workers there, people who were expert in engineering, as the means by which they could achieve scale?
I mean, the short answer is that is what they did until they were almost bankrupt as a result of pursuing that strategy. So in the late 1990s, Apple had this triple continent strategy where they were assembling things in California and Colorado, but also in Ireland, where they still famously have some operations, more of a call center than a manufacturing center these days, and in Singapore. The result of this, though, is that during the 12 years of exile, when Steve Jobs has left the company, he's essentially ousted from the company, but returns very unexpectedly in 1997. During those years, Apple sort of loses its innovative edge, and they're unable to justify the higher cost of the Macintosh as soon as Windows comes out. So the first sort of holiday quarter, Christmas quarter of 1995, when Windows 95 is available, ends up being this crisis for Apple, where they actually have greater revenue that quarter than they've ever had in their 20-year business. And yet they lose money because they were so panicky that they dropped the prices of the computers to below cost. That ends up, resulting in the CEO being ousted, a guy named Michael Spindler. Um, and then a series of crises just really escalates. So after my prologue, the book really begins when Apple is hiring a Chapter 11 lawyer, really believing that bankruptcy could be days or weeks away. And the result of it is they have to adopt a global outsourcing strategy, sell a factory in Colorado, and then we're sort of off to the races where they eventually find China. But it's pretty fascinating. It's like this 7-year story where Apple is building in the UK, right? They're building in Wales through contract manufacturers. They're building in the Czech Republic, in Korea, still in California, also in Mexico. And the most important country for this initial 5-year comeback period of Steve Jobs is actually Taiwan. The first iPods are made there, laptops are made there. And it's really the Taiwanese entrepreneurs. We have to give credit to them as well as just suppliers writ large. They are the ones that move to China. Tim Cook or anyone at Apple is not the architect of this move. It's that the suppliers themselves are in fierce competition to win orders from the big computer makers. And to do that, they want to offer lower prices. And to do that, they are the ones who find China. You could call Tim Cook the admiral. He rides that, sort of navigates that wave better than anybody else.
And you describe in the book the way in which, in the early stages of Apple, some of the work was almost done literally on the kitchen table by family members of the Apple team. But obviously, to achieve scale, you need to have the lowest possible labor costs. And as you said, you need to make sure that you can have reliability in the supply chain. So China offered all that. Was there a reason why China was so willing to be the base for Apple's operations? To what extent was it a conscious decision by the Chinese government? And to what extent was it, as you mentioned, Taiwanese companies and operators like Foxconn that saw the opportunity just a few hundred miles from their base of operations?
Yes, I think this is what makes the first chapter so interesting. I mean, people pointed out that the book is called Apple in China, but China doesn't emerge for a solid 100 pages. And it's really because there's just all sorts of interesting things going on where, among the reasons China emergence is just such a great place to do this is, of course, the desperation of the people to find a better life after the first 3-4 decades of communism in China are really disastrous. I mean, I don't even go into it, but I mean, the famine that's caused by Mao is we're talking 45 million people dying. So the opportunity of finally being able to sort of move around the country, which was illegal under Mao, was, I think, just immensely attractive to what ends up being hundreds of millions of people. The Taiwan connection is really interesting. I don't want to give you a whole history of post-war manufacturing here, but it's the case that at the end of World War II, America has more than 50% of global manufacturing output. But they try to create this world that we now call Pax Americana, where the world is going to be interconnected, right? And so you think of someone like Thomas Friedman in the 1990s talking about the Golden Arches theory of diplomacy. This is his fun way of saying no two countries with McDonald's had ever gone to war with each other. And so America had very much set this up. And so they end up actually training the Japanese how to build a radar and electronics industry after World War II. Japan becomes so good at this that they're sort of able to translate the skills into fabricating semiconductors, right? You'll remember that in the late 1980s, there's a great book by Ezra Fogel called Japan as Number One. And it was a runaway bestseller because Americans were fearful that the Japanese had become so good at electronics manufacturing that this island of some 100 million people, was somehow going to take over America. It sounds sort of comical in retrospect, but it was taken seriously at the time. Well, the Japanese entrepreneurs themselves see that the value of the yen is changing. They're experiencing labor shortages and so forth. And so they began to take their manufacturing prowess and training their former colonies, South Korea and Taiwan. That's actually a big portion of the story as to why those countries are so good with electronics. Same thing happens in Taiwan, an even smaller island than Japan. And so where do they go? They go to the mother of all developing countries. They have a shared lingua franca. And so Taiwanese companies like Foxconn play just an absolutely instrumental role, really across the country, but originally in Shenzhen, where the founder, Terry Guo, doesn't just build factories and attract people. He makes it so that they can live there. He builds dormitories, he builds grocery stores and entertainment venues. And really, it just has this transformative effect on Shenzhen. And so by the time Apple arrives, late as it were, Foxconn and Apple just form this huge partnership where Apple has been Foxconn's largest client over the last 25 years.
There are multiple ironies there, which we might touch on in a second. The fact that it's Taiwan that supercharges investment in China, when, of course, China is now potentially threatening Taiwan's independence. And, of course, the president that we have at the moment, Donald Trump, was the person who was, I suppose, in American public life most suspicious of the threat as it was from Japan 2 decades ago to America's economic hegemony. But from a Chinese point of view, you have this investment coming. This is an opportunity, obviously, for workers to have a higher standard of living and for the country to see its workers trained. Can you give us a sense of the scale of this investment? Because we know that Apple is the company in the world at the moment, I think, with the highest market capitalization. What level of investment are we talking about in China?
So I like this question because you're getting at one of my early lines in the book, which is that our understanding of Apple in China is remarkably narrow. The stories that cover that subject over the last 2 decades are almost invariably about the tedium of assembling Apple products, the idea that there's slavery or sweatshops in China. Accusations of Uyghur labor. People will probably remember there were suicides at the Foxconn factories 15 years ago. All of this stuff has been heavily covered. My book really much flips the narrative and says this is not a story about Apple exploiting China. It's a story about China exploiting Apple. What I mean by that is that this is a story of technology transfer. In other words, you've got an authoritarian government. Why would they put up with all the things that the press has covered the last 20 years if it wasn't hugely beneficial in their own right? So this is the biggest missing piece of the puzzle. And so Apple's own numbers are that since 2008, they have trained 28 million people. I should probably find myself a better UK metaphor, but what I point out is that that's larger than the labor force of California. And in 2015, I'm getting ahead of myself in the narrative, but Xi Jinping has come into office. Apple feels on the back foot. They worry about their products being blacklisted and be the next Facebook, the next Google. And so in thinking of how do we placate local and federal officials, they do their own supply chain study and realize that they're investing $55 billion a year into China by 2015. It's really important to understand this figure. This is not a quid pro quo in any way. This was not a gift to China. This was just the normal course of business. And so once Apple realizes this, they realize there's a massive opportunity to get on the good graces of Chinese leadership. So they multiply that number by 5, right? 275 billion. And Tim Cook goes to Zhongnanhai, the citadel of communist power, just outside the Forbidden City in Beijing, and basically presents this memorandum of understanding that we will invest $275 billion over the next 5 years. And this is an attempt, basically a successful attempt, I would say, to remove the obstacles to production, to ensure that Apple iPhones can still be sold around the country. And $275 billion is such a large figure, I couldn't come up with any corporate equivalent. So this sounded mad to me at the time, and it's actually even madder now that I know that it's the case. But I went to government efforts. And so I thought, well, this is really a nation building effort. And so I looked at the Marshall Plan, right? This is America helping 16 countries, including the UK after World War II. You take that, you convert it to 2015 dollars, and you realize that it's a $130 billion investment. I mean, this was called the most generous gift from one nation to another in the history of humanity. And decades later, Apple is spending double that amount in just a 5-year period in China. And of course, the most controversial thing, or the most interesting thing about that, besides the dollars, is that this is at a time when it's already clear that China is America's greatest adversary. So the geopolitics of this, considering it's just a corporate history, are pretty stunning and hard to wrap your head around. And so if the listener is thinking like, wait a minute, like if you're confused by what I've just said, or that's sort of having to make you pause, then that probably means you're getting it, because I grappled with this for several months and was stunned by the implications of my own research.
$275 billion is bigger than the annual economy of many developed nations. And when you spend that amount of money or invest that amount of money, even in an economy as large as China, it can't just be about having people in Shenzhen or Xinjiang assembling products. In effect, this wasn't just an investment in labor, it was a transfer of intellectual property, vocational education, skills, and the handing over to China of the means not to become the implementer of Apple's strategy alone, but a rival to Apple in due course.
Yes, it's fascinating. So just around this time, Tim Cook was actually testifying in Congress in the first months of Xi Jinping entering office. And what he was accused of by Senator Carl Levin in fairly biting ways was outsourcing Apple profits to tax havens like in Ireland and getting in real trouble for this. And I thought, in retrospect, Carl Levin was just sort of tip of the iceberg, didn't understand what he was uncovering, because Apple isn't sort of just guilty of outsourcing profits. which are, I should stop using this word, ethereal. There's a couple ways of saying
Yes.
it. Temporary, let's say.
Mm.
It was outsourcing innovation, right? I mean, America over the last few decades has very much been hollowed out as an industrial power. And the biggest implications, I think, of my story are not that, well, we lost out to a company that, or a country that was better at manufacturing. It's really that we just voluntarily gave it all away. My metaphor for Apple alone is that they played the role of Prometheus, handing the Chinese the gift of fire.
And in that sense, we now have a situation where in China, obviously there have been telecoms giants like Huawei that have developed. China's developed its own operating system to use on platforms which rivals Apple's own operating system or the Android system. Is it fair to say, I used the Frankenstein monster analogy earlier, is it fair to say that in that sense, Apple has been played by China?
Yeah, that's very much part of the thesis. I mean, the Chinese are famously long-term in their thinking, and I think they use that strategy against the short-term interests of a corporation. I don't use the metaphor in the book, but it's hard not to think of something Lenin apparently said, more than 100 years ago, which is that we will hang the capitalists by the very rope that they sell us. And I think my book is sort of the high-tech 21st century equivalent of that.
And in that regard, there was a critical moment, wasn't there, when Apple would have felt the rope tightening around their neck, which is what happened on what the Chinese call Consumer Day. Can you say just a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is the prologue to the book. Someone compared it to White Lotus. I don't know how popular that show is in the UK.
Very.
But, it begins with a murder, right?
Yeah.
And then the rest of the book is sort of, or the rest of the show is sort of a beach read, right? Like it's a pleasant thing to watch, except that it has this overhang of tension because there's a murder. My book is structured in a similar sense because the first 36 hours of Xi Jinping coming into presidency in 2013, Apple is the first company that's attacked. I mean, it's kind of fascinating in retrospect because it takes scholars and certainly lay people several years to realize that Xi Jinping is sort of the Putin of China, if you will. He campaigns. Well, I shouldn't say he campaigns internally, right? It's not a democracy, but he's chosen, let's say, by his peers because of his anti-corruption tendencies. And it takes us a while to realize that actually what he's doing is he's using anti-corruption as a air cover to take out his political rivals and take on greater power. And now, of course, he's in an unprecedented third term, which was supposed to not be able to happen after Mao and the Chinese constitution had been rewritten. But Apple is the first company that is attacked, and it's attacked because China has something called Consumer Day, when companies are sort of called out every year on CCTV. You could call that the state equivalent of the BBC or something. And, it's just that companies are called out for not living up to the socialist values. It was a very local thing in the 90s. In the 2000s, you begin to have some foreign companies called out. And in 2013, 36 hours after Xi Jinping has come into office, Apple is called out. They're called out for reasons that were sort of mystifying in the way that, like, when you're reading mythology, it's always something really strange. Like, someone discovers the key to life or whatever, and then it's stolen by a snake or something, right? There's always some small thing. And in this case, it's warranty differences. So Apple gets attacked for having different warranty policies in China than everywhere else. And Apple's really flummoxed by this. I mean, they literally had a team of people watching this in China live as it happened, just curious about where the information was coming from, because it just wasn't really the case. And so there's this sort of mystery because it gets covered all over the world. And I don't think anyone had ever really figured out the whole story. And I can't go into it now, but it is sort of a riddle that's solved in the book. But it involves multiple things, like the fact that there were hundreds, if not thousands, as crazy as that sounds, of fake stores in the country. And some of these Apple stores were so good that the employees working for them in their blue Apple t-shirts thought they were working for Apple. Well, you can imagine if you've cracked your iPhone screen and you go to one of these stores, that they're not going to give you the courteous service that Cupertino demands, because it's just a grift, right? But in addition to that, you had... This is such a crazy narrative, Michael, and I know you've read the book, so I don't want to get into it. But the 30-second version of it is that the most fascinating part of the book is part 4, and it's about the birth of the iPhone as a product within China. And what happened is that in 2010, the iPhone 4 it just goes absolutely wild. It becomes the conspicuous thing that everybody wants to have in China, but there are only 4 official Apple stores in the country. So 1 store per 350 million people. And these gangsters, these scalpers known as yellow cows within the country, some of which are backed by the triads, okay, so the Asian equivalent of the mafia, and they begin to be the de facto distribution arm. And so to buy as many iPhones as they can, they literally bust in migrants from different parts of of outside Beijing or Shanghai, let's say. And so you have snake lines of 7,000 people at times going around these Apple stores. Everyone's allowed to acquire 2 phones each, and then the phones are basically collected in a massive bus, and they're taken to a city like Chongqing, population 32 million in 2010. And these gangsters are the monopolist distributor of the world's most iconic products, just as you've got a growing middle class in China and a sense that everyone wants to show it. I mean, people might remember stories of like in Shanghai, when you were finally allowed to have money, men kept the price tags of their suits off the wrist just to indicate that they had purchased it, right? So you really have to know something about China to understand what it meant to flout your wealth around this time. And Apple just becomes instrumental in that sort of nouveau riche sense.
And of course, as you say, the quality of Apple's design, the sophistication of their technology meant that it became a good of ostentation, a way in Chinese society of showing that you were with it and upwardly mobile. That might seem to speak to Apple's influence, but ultimately, as you point out, it was Apple that had to bow to the Chinese state when the Chinese state issued this story or created this scare about a 2-tier treatment of warranties, the strong implication for the Chinese being that Apple was somehow gulling them. And we have, over time, a situation that develops whereby Apple recognized that it couldn't decouple itself from China, that it was in too deep. And one of the things that you discuss later in the book is whether or not there is a plan B for Apple, given that it depends so heavily on China. Do you think that Apple can diversify the way in which its products are designed and manufactured and improved?
Yeah, so there must be several listeners that are thinking, well, this sounds like a solved problem because, of course, they're diversifying to India. And they're really not. They're diversifying final assembly, and they've been doing that since 2017 because Narendra Modi knew that he had an 8% growing GDP in the country. A big middle class that was developing. Apple recognized that they had smartphone market share of less than 1% in India. And so if you were going to build the next great market, it was going to be in a country of 1.5 billion people. And it wasn't going to help that Modi had put 20% tariffs on phones coming from China. So Samsung, a whole host of other companies begin building in India. Apple's not unique in this sense. But when we say building, I'm being too generous. Really what's happening is if there are 1,000 steps in making an iPhone, and the final step is now done in India, the final assembly, that is enough for a quote unquote substantive change to the product that allows you to say that it was made in India. But any, let's say, American or Brit who buys an iPhone that says made in India next year, that phone will not be any less dependent on the China-centric supply chain that Apple has created over the last 25 years than any other phone. Now, you have to start somewhere to be sympathetic to Apple. It might be the case that there is real depth and breadth to the supply chain in India in 5, 10, 15 years from now. But the more you understand about how much investment has gone on in China and what order of magnitude superiority they have over really anybody else, let alone India, which is really just starting on this big wave, the more you get pessimistic, unfortunately, I think. One thing I would point out is that my book goes into considerable detail about how much influence Apple engineers had within the factories of hundreds of suppliers, right? To get to Apple's quality levels and then maintain that quality even as something like the iPhone goes from 5 million units in 2007 to nearly 250 million by 2015. But what Apple was not doing was building the 8-lane highways between the factories and the ports, right? It wasn't building the high-speed rail. China was a once-in-a-century partner for this sort of thing. I don't know that India has what it takes. It doesn't have the same sort of Nietzschean will to power of greatness through manufacturing. That's pretty unique to China.
And again, given that we have China's concentration on and ability to think ahead, and they have the technological and the infrastructure strength that's been built up over years, as we contemplate some of the changes that are going to affect all of us in the next few years, in particular, the galloping development of artificial intelligence. Do you believe that all of these ingredients together mean that China has all of the potential, essentially, to use everything that Apple and others have given it and its own investment to power ahead of the United States and the West in the technologies of the next decade?
Yes. I mean, I've had people basically end the book, enjoying the read, but saying like they're either angry or that they're fearful. And yeah, that's a solid reading of the book. That's where I'm at too. I think if the book has an influence in recognizing how complacent we've been, and sort of injects a sense of real change. I mean, I'm not an activist style journalist. The book is really written neutral in tone, and it's really just like a how it happened narrative. There's no particular villains. I don't portray Tim Cook in sort of some nasty sense, but you could argue that what Apple did was betray America. Again, that's not in the book, but I understand where readers get there, and having spoken to them for the last 2 or 3 months, I get that. But I don't hold out a whole lot of hope for us to be able to regain that sort of skill. What I do think is that in the aggregate, the Western world does have what it takes, right? So in other words, I would be against sort of any bilateral trade deal between any country and China. I think we basically need to be working together. iPhones are never going to be made in Pittsburgh or Ohio, but maybe they could be made in India, and maybe they can be made in Mexico at scale. The trouble is, even Apple, as large as it is, they can't do that alone. Beijing would have to be at the negotiating table, because what you've seen in the last few months is, for India to set up its production lines, it basically needs 2 things. Machinery, sophisticated machinery, a lot of which is now built in China. And it needs the Chinese people that have the experiential know-how to transfer that skill set, right? So to go full circle in our conversation where I talked about Japanese entrepreneurs teaching their former colonies and then the Taiwanese teaching the Chinese, the next leg really in this development is for the Chinese to teach India, right? That if they're chasing labor, that's what any company would naturally do. But Beijing has blocked visas of Chinese people that could go to India. And when it sees at customs machinery that's bound for a production line for the iPhone in Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, they blocked it. So Beijing is basically very clearly stepping in and saying, we understand the value of what it means to have Apple's operational prowess in your country better than anybody else, and we're not going to let go of it.
In a way, what you're arguing for is a sort of approach whereby there is an economic coalition of the willing, whereby through friendshoring and working together, those countries that are committed to essentially a more open economy recognize that unless they work together, that China will steal a march on the rest of us.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a contradiction here. Back in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were sort of the epitome of Western leaders who advocated for free trade, they didn't include the Soviet Union.
No.
Right? And so it's not a contradiction to say that maybe we need to sort of derail the relationship with China. The problem is, Apple alone in any individual quarter imports more from China than than America imported from the Soviet Union over the entire duration of the Cold War, right? Elon Musk, I think, has put it best by saying United States and China are basically like conjoined twins. Any surgery attempt to separate them might result in the death of both. That's a pretty stunning analogy that's worth sort of thinking about before we take any real drastic action. So it's going to be a long-term plan, not a quick-term fix, to sort of lessen our dependence on China. But I think it's a problem of epic proportions. I mean, it's strange for a corporate history to get to so fundamental as those types of questions. But one thing I would say to the listener is that if you need to get up to speed on US-China tech competition, like there's no better or fun way to get there than reading the book, because it's just a fast-paced narrative written for the layperson rather than an academic treatise that might get you to the same place, but is probably going to be a little dull in holding your hand to get there. That was sort of the point of the book, the hope for the book.
I would completely endorse that. For anyone watching this who's thinking about what a beach read might be, a perfect beach read might be, then I would recommend Apple in China, because it's a cracking, pacey story with some compelling characters, and it tells you truths about the way in which world economic system works, and I certainly shan't try to preach, which does make you think again and does make you realize some of what's at stake. But one final and perhaps almost frivolous question, Patrick. Are you an iPhone and a PowerBook user? When it comes to your own tech, what do you favor, and what advice would you give to Spectator readers and viewers? Should we ditch the iPhone and move to Samsung? What is the best way forward, both in terms of the consumer experience and also vigilance about what we may have in our top pockets or on our desks?
No, I don't think it's a frivolous question at all. And, that's not a question I really thought about during the writing of the book. But I've had to, lots of people have asked it since. And I suppose if there was some clear American competitor, the case would maybe be more compelling. Not to say that I don't support Samsung and Korea, but it's a little bit of a mental leap to sort of make that distinction. So look, I'm speaking to you on a MacBook Air. I'm locally recording the interview on the iPhone. The Apple Watch is behind me, on me. Behind me is some 1998 Apple posters. No, look, I've been an Apple fanboy, and the book is written, I think, from the perspective of an Apple fanboy. What I would say is that I quote these notes that I got. They're notes that Steve Jobs took, and they're cited for the first time. And this is in the months in late 1997 when he has not decided to be CEO of Apple, but it's been offered to him. And so it gives you a sense of what he's thinking. Why doesn't he want to take the role, and why does he end up taking it? And he's so angry at Apple at the time. And he's been talking to loads of customers. And what he says is that people love Apple, people love Mac, the product, but they hate Apple, the company. And he compares it to, people not wanting to have friends over to show their Apple products. And that's a little bit how I feel now. I'm disappointed by the decisions that the company has made. I think this is basically why so many people, more than 200 with Apple experience, would talk to me, because there's a real disquieting sense within the company that something needs to change. And I have real questions about the leadership of Tim Cook and whether he's the right person to take Apple into the next chapter. But I do think Apple products are great, and I'm not an activist trying to push an agenda. If somebody buys Samsung devices after reading the book, I completely understand. I'm thinking about it myself. I haven't made the move yet. I hope that doesn't make me a hypocrite.
It certainly doesn't. It makes you someone whose story is written from the point of view of an objective reporter fascinated by, I think, the economic story of our times. I heartily recommend the book to our listeners, viewers, and readers. And Patrick, thank you for your time, and good luck.
Thank you, Michael.